So before I get started with this video, an apology for how long it's been since I've put anything up. I've had a very busy couple of weeks. The couple of weeks that I'm facing after this are also going to continue to be busy, but I'm squeezing in a few moments here to talk about something that's been on my mind for quite a while. This is a book that I read, and then I found myself unable to stop thinking about because it's one of those books that I don't necessarily agree with, but on every page, I was confronted with something to think about that required me to put down a lot of my existing assumptions, a lot of my unquestioned assumptions, and really look at them harder than I have in a very long time. And the book in question is Günther Anders' The Obsolescence of the Human. And this is the first translation into English of this work. This book was originally written in German. It's actually a collection of 3 different works that were written over a period of several years. The first of which was published in, I think, 1957, 1958. So it's going back quite a ways. The scary thing about it is that for a book that was started in the late 50s, there are things on every page, again, that feel like they are absolutely of the moment. There is very little in this book that has aged badly. It's only some of the ways those perspectives are expanded on and the larger implications of them, I think, that have dated somewhat. And Günther Anders himself admits this in the introduction to the book, which is actually the introduction to the 5th German edition of the book, which was published, I think, the late 70s or something like that, where he talks about how some of the prognoses that he made about technology in the book do feel like he was overstating matters a bit, and that there were some positive impacts that he saw, namely the way that television was able to awaken people to the reality of the Vietnam War, for instance. But he still felt a lot of what he had to say was relevant and valid and timely. And the book collects 3 longish essays. There's actually a 4th essay in there about Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, which is nice, but it's not actually related to the big gist of the book, in my opinion, which is about the human relationship with its creations, with technology. And the 3 big sections of the book, I'm going to read here from the table of contents. They're titled On Promethean Shame and The World as Phantom and Matrix, Philosophical Reflections on Radio and Television, and On the Bomb and the Roots of Our Apocalypse Blindness. And it's important to note with regard to that third one that Anders was a fierce critic of the nuclear state, as it were. He was a very fierce critic of the bomb. He was also a fierce critic of nuclear energy, a position which, in my opinion, has not dated well, but he was coming at this from the point of view of a world that had just freshly emerged from the ashes of World War II and was contemplating thermonuclear annihilation at every turn. And to him, it seemed like the only moral thing to do was to be against the bomb and against all of the things that the bomb had also facilitated. Now, the first essay, On Promethean Shame, it's about the way that people will create things and then feel inferior to their creations, even though they aren't really aware of that feeling of inferiority at the time, but that will manifest through their behavior and their attitudes and their outlooks. And I figured the best way to talk about this would just be to read a few quotes from the book and to reflect on each of them in turn. So he says, humans want to make themselves, not because they can no longer tolerate anything that was not made by them, anything that is not part of the natural world as is such, but because they too no longer want to be something not made. They feel indignant not because they were made by others, by God, gods, or nature, but because they were not made at all, and as such are inferior to all their fabricated things. And the way he elaborates on this idea is by pointing out how one of the advantages of things that are fabricated is that they're perfectly interchangeable. If a pen dies, if you run out of ink on a pen, you don't necessarily lament the loss of that pen. You toss it away and you get a new one. And that takes so many questions out of the way, and the question of attachment to a particular thing. You don't have to be attached to any particular thing anymore. You can just continue to work with it. And that also plays into further discussion that he has about everything being reduced to its use value, that everything is only important in as much as it can be monetized and used for something. And even things that we don't think necessarily are being pushed at us for the sake of their utility are, in fact, being pushed at us for the sake of their utility. One of the other big points that he makes through this essay is that he's constantly, and this is actually something that's common through all of the sections of this book, he's constantly anticipating the arguments of his potential critics and smacking back against them as quickly as he can. So one of the things that he's anticipating is the idea that any critique of technology essentially means that you're a Luddite and you don't want technology to be used. You want us all to go back to the cave. And he makes a very direct point of this. He says, today, even the most dreadful machine can be successfully justified and defended if its critics are suspected of being Luddites. And since nothing is easier than making that insult, this always succeeds. So his point is that the critique of the machine ends up becoming a critique of the critic. This is another passage where he explains his philosophy about the interchangeability of things as being an ideal, a new ideal for human beings. The world we live in today is certainly no kingdom of ideas, but it is surely undeniable that it is more Platonist than any human world has ever been before. This is precisely because our world is made up of things that are for the most part mass-produced to a specific norm. These products owe their existence to ideas. They have come into the world as imitations or imprints of prototype models, blueprints, or master copies. None of the things, the emphasis his, produced in this way now makes or can make the arrogant claim of being itself. None is individual and singular in anything other than a numerical sense, for the ideas they incorporate also provided the blueprint for their sister pieces. As long as items produced to an unchanged model are kept in stock, as long as a new individual item can step in for a damaged one, for this specific burned-out light bulb here, for example, it's merely a question of money whether one deems the thing one possesses mortal or immortal. For the man who is flush with cash, each thing can reincarnate itself in a new one. And again, the point that he wants to draw from this is that when we look at that kind of immortality in the form of something that has no singular existence, we begin to get a little jealous. We begin to envy the things that break down and can be replaced, because we ourselves break down, but we can't be replaced. And when we live in a world that has been created along those lines, it's hard not to feel like you're inferior to your own creation. The second section of the book, which is about the way that radio and television and mass communication of those kinds have changed human lives, is something that I came into thinking that it would have dated badly. And the scary thing is that it has not, because a lot of the observations that he makes aren't tied to the incarnations of those things in any one particular moment in time. He's talking about aspects of them that are indivisible from the way they function. This is, by the way, an important point that he brings up over and over again, which is that there is no such thing as a means and an end that are separate from each other. Every means always becomes an end of some kind. And every time we try to rationalize that away or pretend that it doesn't exist, we're just falling further and further into the trap of being enslaved by the very things that we're creating. In fact, The World as Phantom and Matrix opens with a discussion of those very things. He says, the first reaction to the critique of radio and television presented here will be that such generalizations aren't permitted, that everything depends on what we make of these installations, on whether they are used for good or bad, for human or inhuman, social or antisocial ends. This optimistic argument is well known, insofar as a pattern of speech can actually be called an argument. Its origins lie in the first industrial revolution, and it lives on in all camps, unexamined as ever. Its applicability is more than questionable, though. The assumption that we have freedom of use and power over technology is a mere illusion, as is the belief that certain parts of our world are nothing but means to which good ends can be attached at will. Radio and television installations are facts in and of themselves. They mold and influence us, regardless of the ends we use them for. And this circumstance cannot simply be undone by verbally downgrading them into means. This actually parallels something that I was talking about a couple of videos ago when I was talking about the movie Koyaanisqatsi, and its director Godfrey Reggio, who also has a similar critique of technology. And he had a phrase that I find myself thinking of often, which is, we do not so much use technology as we live technology, that we are entirely inside its envelope, for better or for worse. And that the point is not to try and shrug off this envelope entirely, but rather to become as fully aware of it as we can. So a key point that he makes with his critique of radio and TV is that they bring the world to us, and that's the problem. And that seems like something that shouldn't be a problem at first. How is that a problem when it's convenient and it makes the world seem bigger? Well, it's a problem because it saves us the trouble of ever having to go and experience the world for ourselves. The more we have the world brought to us in this digitized form, the more it becomes easier to shrug the world off as nothing but a series of images that are broadcast at us. Here's another segment where he talks about the way that operates. He says, "The family is dissolved regardless of appearances. It is now the broadcast external world, be it fictional or real, that rules at home. Its reign is so boundless that it invalidates the reality of the home and gives it a phantom-like quality, invalidating the reality of not just the four walls and furniture, but communal life itself. When distant things step too close, closeness becomes distant or blurred. When the phantom becomes real, reality attains a phantom-like quality. The home is reduced to a container, and its sole function is to house the screen for the outside world." And again, all this was written in the late 50s, and yet at the same time, I say to myself, this is a situation that persists right to the present day. If anything, it's even worse now, because it's not as if we have just the living room with a single TV in it that the family gathers around and some semblance of, communion. It's that we all have a screen in our pocket, and so that we're now all that much more alienated and atomized from each other. And in fact, he goes into some discussion of the fact that TV screens are small and that the technical limitations about their size is probably something that's going to be done away with. But he talks about how the very smallness of the screen is itself an advantage for what it does, because it makes all of these things feel intimate, falsely intimate. The word he uses is cosification. And that cosification allows us to have a false relationship with all of these things from the outside world that are broadcast at us. We think that they're getting closer to us, but they're not. They're just images that are broadcast at us, which we don't have any say over. And I'm pretty sure that if Anders had lived to see all of this today, he would have disputed the idea that because something like YouTube has at least a degree of two-way communication to it, that the problem is solved. If anything, the problem is just hidden away, or the can of the problem is kicked that much further down the road. And the third big essay, which is basically about the kind of the world, the moral dimensions of the world that we live in because of the atomic bomb, this is the one that, on the one hand, I think has dated somewhat poorly because of his attitudes about nuclear energy and so forth, but there are other parts of it that have not dated at all. In particular, his attitude towards how the fact of the atomic bomb creates a world where endless horror is possible at the push of a button. And yet at the same time, we don't really seem to be all that troubled by it. Or to the degree that we are troubled by it, we say, but what can we do about it? And there's a passage where he goes into some passionate detail in this fashion. "We are incapable of feeling regret or crying over 10 murdered people. Our capacity to feel remorse cannot expand itself sufficiently to comprehend 10 murders. We might be able to imagine those 10 dead when pushed, but kill? We could kill tens of thousands easily, and this capacity for killing can be increased further without difficulty. Or we can be afraid of our own death. Yet it is already too much to empathically intuit the mortal fear of 10 others. But at the thought of the apocalypse, the soul goes on strike. The thought remains but a word." The idea being that these things are just so huge. The idea of the annihilation of human life as we know it at the push of a button is just, it's of a moral dimension that is simply impossible for us to contemplate. We don't have any way to fit it into our heads. The only ways that we've been able to fit it into our heads over the decades since the atomic bomb first came into existence is by way of things like shock tactics, basically. Those of you who are old enough to remember TV movies like The Day After and Threads, which were dramatizations of what would happen in a nuclear attack, those were probably some of the very few ways that people were actually introduced firsthand to the possibility of what the destruction of the world would look like through nuclear war. And again, done through images broadcast to us. Now, part of why I've been so fascinated by this book is, again, because I don't necessarily agree with everything in there, but whenever I've come across a book that argues passionately, angrily even, and with a case to make that is designed to get us to think about things that we do not question on a daily basis, I have a sympathy for it. And I chiefly have a sympathy for it, and this is, again, where the concerns of the channel come back in, because these are really rich sources of ideas to contemplate in a story about the fantastic. I've always been most interested in stories about the fantastic that have a degree of iconoclasty to them, meaning that they look at some big unquestioned assumption about our world and they challenge it vigorously. One of my favorite science fiction authors, Theodore Sturgeon, was particularly good at this. And many of his challenges in that respect were about sex and society, and he would do that through a science fiction lens. And of course, there's Philip K. Dick, my other favorite, and his big question was, what it meant to be human, and how the de-definition of that plays into this incremental feeling of alienation we have as the years go by, and this technological nightmare that we're all building for ourselves. I don't know what, if anything, Günther Anders or Philip K. Dick would have thought of each other if they even knew of each other, but I have a feeling they would have nodded approvingly in each other's directions. So a lot of why I tend to take books like this as seriously as I can, even if I don't take every single word seriously or literally, is because they're rich fuel for thought and rich fuel for developing ideas about how science fiction and fantasy stories can be confrontatory, about how they can get us to challenge ourselves and in turn challenge the audience. And the most important thing about these challenges is that they should come in a way that allow us to see how some part of that challenge can be taken back out into the world that we live in daily. I mentioned how Anders in his preface was saying that one of the positive things about the technological communication system that we developed for ourselves was that it awakened many people morally to the horrors of the Vietnam War. So the idea that we are all dead, soulless, and zombified is not something that I buy. I am very much of the belief that there is decency in everybody, and that if we use stories and storytelling as a way to take all of the things about our world that have become indecent without us noticing, and use these things to show how decency is again possible, then you have a template, you have a blueprint, a demonstration for how things can be changed incrementally, if only, in our real world. And I think that's a really noble thing to aim for, and potentially also a very entertaining one, because let's face it, some of the most subversive entertainments, first and foremost, they had to be entertainments, but they also subverted many expectations beautifully. I go back to The Matrix for this one all the time. This was probably one of the most subversive pieces of entertainment that was ever created by a major entertainment conglomerate, and nobody realized it at the time. So once again, the book in question is Günther Anders, The Obsolescence of the Human. It's available in print format and also in Kindle and other digital formats. And it has awakened in me a great curiosity for the rest of this man's work. I'm hoping it will continue to be brought out into English. Up until this point, there were only studies of him available in English, but not his actual work. So having this available to an English-speaking audience is very encouraging, and I'm really curious to see what else turns up from it. And again, when you read this, the point is not to agree with everything. You may find yourself disagreeing with literally every single page of it, but I found so many things to think about that I would have not had anywhere else, that the whole thing was more than worth the effort. So I do encourage you to check it out. And once again, until next time, stay curious.